The mechanical bird stopped singing on a Tuesday. Pell noticed because he was the one who wound it every morning, 2 turns of the brass key on its belly, and that morning the key turned freely with no resistance, like something had broken loose inside. He pressed the small lever on its back. Nothing. He pressed it again. The bird sat on his palm, copper feathers catching light, completely silent. He did not cry. He was 9 years old in dragon years, which meant he was old enough to understand that crying over a broken toy was something his siblings would remember for the rest of their very long lives. So he sat on the edge of his sleeping stone and stared at the bird for a long time, and the only thing in the room that moved was the smoke curling off the tip of his snout. The bird had belonged to his mother. She had bought it from a traveling merchant the winter before she died, wound it herself, and set it on Pell's windowsill where the morning light caught the rubies in its eyes. It had sung every day since then, until it didn't. His brother Vesin found him an hour later and asked what was wrong, and Pell showed him the bird. Vesin held it, pressed the lever, frowned, and said, "There's a man in the lower town who fixes things." Pell looked up. He fixed Sora's compass, the one that stopped pointing north. Vesin handed the bird back carefully. "She didn't tell you because she didn't want to explain where she'd been, but he fixed it in 3 days." "What kind of man?" Pell asked. "Just a man, old. He smells like iron and lamp oil. He has a sign above his door." Vesin paused. He didn't charge her anything. Pell looked at the bird again. Outside the window of the spire, the valley stretched away below them, dotted with the smoke of Veldmore's ironworks. The lower town, human territory. Their father's standing order was clear. The hatchlings did not go to the lower town alone. They did not speak to humans without a guard present, and they did not, under any circumstances, draw attention to themselves outside the spire. Pell tucked the bird into the front of his jacket and went to find the stairs. He had never been to Veldmore without an escort before. It was louder than he expected. The ironworks produced a constant low hammering that you could feel in your teeth, and the streets smelled of coal and bread and animal dung in a combination that should not have worked, but somehow wasn't awful. The people moved fast, and none of them looked up, which suited Pell fine. He kept to the edges of the road, which was easier than he expected. He was small for his age and could fold his wings flat against his back until he looked, from a distance, like a large dog walking on its hind legs. The shop was on the eastern edge of town, pressed between a farrier and a building that appeared to sell only rope. The sign above the door read, in faded paint, "If it's broken, bring it here." Pell stood in front of it for a moment. Then he went around to the back, because the front door was on the main road, and he had not worked out how to open it without his claws getting in the way. The back door was already open. A man sat at a workbench with his back to the door, bent over something small under a bright lamp. He had grey in his hair and grease on his hands, and he was humming something tuneless under his breath. He did not look up when Pell's shadow fell across the floor. "Be with you in a moment," he said. Pell stood in the doorway. He had prepared something to say, a short sentence, formal enough to show he wasn't begging, casual enough not to sound ridiculous. He had rehearsed it on the walk down the mountain. He forgot all of it. Instead, he walked forward, held out both hands, and opened them. The man turned. He looked at Pell. He looked at the bird. He picked up the bird very carefully, the way someone picks up something they already understand is precious, and turned it over in his fingers. He pressed the lever. He turned the key. He tilted it and listened, and then he made a quiet sound in the back of his throat that was not surprise and not pity, but something in between. "One of the spring coils has snapped," he said. "Probably metal fatigue. How old is it?" Pell said, "About a year." "I can fix it." The man set the bird down on the bench. "Give me an hour." He did not ask what a dragon hatchling was doing alone in his shop. He did not ask what the bird was worth or who had made it. He did not look nervous, which Pell found confusing, because most humans looked nervous when a dragon was standing in a small enclosed space near them. He just turned back to his bench and started working. Pell crouched down in the corner, wrapped his tail around his feet, and watched. The man's hands moved slowly and carefully, the way hands move when they know what they're doing. He had a row of small tools on a strip of leather: picks, pliers, pins, things Pell had no name for. He used 3 of them. He did not rush. 50 minutes later, he set the bird in Pell's hands and pressed the lever. It sang. Pell stood very still. The bird's song was exactly the same as it had always been: 4 notes, looping, bright, and it filled the shop and went out through the open back door into the afternoon, and Pell pressed it against his chest and held it there. The man had already turned back to his other work. Pell left without saying anything. He was on the road back up the mountain before he realized he had not even asked the man's name. He came back the next week to find out. It was Corvin. Vesin had 1 question per visit. That was how it started, and it was never the same question twice. The first time he came, tagging along with Pell 2 weeks after the bird, he brought a shattered constellation map, a glass sphere the size of a melon, cracked clean down the middle. He set it on the counter with both hands and then immediately asked Corvin why human clocks had to tick. Corvin looked at him. What? Dragon timepieces use water. The water moves through a channel and the level tells you the hour. No noise. Why do yours have to make a sound? Corvin considered this. He was already examining the sphere, turning the 2 halves slowly in the light. Because someone in the dark needs to know the clock is still running, he said finally. Water is silent. You can't hear it working. A man alone in a room, in the middle of the night, the ticking is how he knows time hasn't stopped. Vesin thought about that for a moment. Then he sat down on a crate and watched Corvin work, and did not ask another question for 3 entire minutes, which was a record. The sphere took 4 days. The crack ran through the etched constellation lines in a way that made the break nearly invisible once the adhesive cured, but Corvin had to re-engrave 2 of the line segments by hand because the break had taken the detail with it. He used a tool that was barely thicker than a needle. Vesin watched all 4 afternoons, sitting on the same crate, and asked his 1 question each day. Why did humans build things so small? Because our hands are small. Small hands make small things, and small things can be carried when you have to run. Did Corvin know how to make anything that was just beautiful and not useful? He was quiet for a moment, and then he pulled open a drawer and showed Vesin a small enameled box, blue and gold, that he'd made for his wife before they were married. No lock, no purpose, just a box. Vesin held it for a long time. Did it bother him that the things he fixed would eventually break again? No, he said that was why there was work. Nothing stayed fixed forever. You just fixed it for as long as you could, and then fixed it again when it broke. Vesin carried the repaired sphere back up the mountain and told Sora about the box. Sora came alone. She chose a morning when she knew Pell and Vesin were at their fire studies and would not see her go. She told herself she was going because she was curious. She almost believed it. She had a compass that had not pointed north since the month their mother died. She had assumed it was damaged in the chaos of that time. The running, the fire, the long silent weeks inside the spire walls while her father stood at his window and did not speak. She had not given it to any of the spire's craftworkers because she did not want it handled by someone who would ask about the engraving on the back. The engraving was her mother's name. She set the compass on Corvin's counter and told him what it was and what it did and what it did not do anymore. She did not tell him about the engraving. She told herself she would be in and out fast and that she was only going to leave it and come back in a few days when it was done. She came back the next morning. She stood outside for 10 minutes before going in. He was already working on it, the back panel open. The needle assembly removed and lying on a strip of cloth. He glanced up, said she was early, and went back to work. She sat down on the crate Vesin had apparently been using for weeks, judging by the worn patch on the wood. She watched his hands. They did not shake. Most human hands shook when she was in the room. The needle lost its charge, he said without looking up. I can remagnetize it. The casing is fine. There's some corrosion around one of the screws. I'll clean it, but I'll try not to disturb the back panel. She said, "Why?" "Because things on the back panel are usually there for a reason." She looked out the window. The coal smoke sat low over the town. Children were running in the street, chasing something she couldn't see, laughing the way only something very small and very sure of its own safety can laugh. She came back the next 3 mornings and said very little. On the third morning, Corvin set the compass on the counter in front of her, and the needle was pointing north, and the engraving was completely untouched. She picked it up, she put it in her pocket, she said, "You didn't charge us anything for any of us." Corvin shrugged, which was a gesture she was starting to understand meant he had thought about something and decided it was simple. "Your children, you didn't have anything to pay. It would have been a strange thing to make you feel like you owed me for asking for help." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back, plain and unhurried, the way a mountain looks when it's not trying to impress anyone. She left without another word. She came back 2 days later with a clock she'd found in a storeroom that nobody had touched in 40 years. It wasn't broken, she'd checked. She just wanted somewhere to sit that wasn't the spire. Corvin pulled up a second crate without being asked, and neither of them mentioned it. The burned field appeared on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, every trader on the main road had packed their cart and gone north. Corvin heard about it from the farrier next door, who heard it from a grain merchant, who had seen it himself on his way in from the eastern road, 20 acres of winter wheat, black and flat, and still smoking at the edges. No lightning, no campfire accident. The burn pattern was too clean, too deliberate, going right up to the field's fence line and stopping exactly there, the way fire stops when it's being controlled rather than spreading. A message, then. By evening, the word had a name attached to it, Ashvale, the northern faction, led by a commander called Thon, who had been burning his way south for 6 months, and who had, according to the stories, a very specific objective. Everyone in Veldmore knew the spire was above them on the mountain. Everyone had always known. It had never seemed like a problem before. Now it did. Corvin kept his shop open. He had a window shutter to repair and a set of balance weights to calibrate for the butcher on the south road, and those things needed doing regardless of what was happening on the eastern field. Vesson came in through the back window at mid-morning, which had become his usual method of entry because the back window latch required no fine motor skill to open, unlike the front door handle which had defeated him twice. He was not carrying anything this time. He dropped onto the floor and sat immediately, which was not his way. Vesson was usually in motion, looking at things, picking things up, asking about them. He asked why the lower town looked different today. Corvin told him about the field. Vesson was quiet for longer than he had ever been quiet in Corvin's shop. Then he said, "Our father has called us back. He sent a messenger this morning. Sora said we should leave right away." A pause. Pell dropped the bird on the stairs. "We came back for it." Corvin found the bird on the floor near the workbench. A gear had come free from the impact, small, flat, the kind that looked irrelevant until everything stopped because it was missing. He found it 3 inches away, half under the leg of the bench. He put it back, set the casing, wound the key, and pressed the lever. The bird sang. He handed it to Vesson without a word. Then he took off his apron, hung it on the hook by the door, and said, "Come on." Vesson stared at him. "Where?" "I'm walking you to the road. The Spire Road is on the other side of town." "I know where it is." He had not thought about what it would look like. He would think about that later, alone, and decide that even if he had thought about it, he probably would have done the same thing, because the alternative was 3 children walking through a town that was frightened and looking for something to be frightened of, and children should not have to navigate that alone. So he walked them through the center of Veldmore. All 3 of them, Pell had come back for the bird, and Sora had come back for Pell, and so all 3 were there, taller than most of the people on the road, but trying to make themselves small in the way that only works when you are very young and have not yet learned that presence cannot be compressed. People stopped and stared. That was fine. People always stared. The market stallholders went quiet as they passed. The blacksmith at the corner stood in his doorway, Two of Warden Goss's men, standing near the water pump, watched the whole thing without moving. Corvin walked at a normal pace, nodded to the people who made eye contact, and kept moving. He did not hurry, he did not look behind him. The three hatchlings walked close together at his side, and Vessen's shoulder was about level with Corvin's ear, and the mechanical bird sang once faintly through the fabric of Pell's jacket. He stopped when the road curved uphill, and the stone marker for the Spire territory appeared at the edge of the path. Beyond it was dragon ground, and he had no business there. He turned around. The hatchlings had stopped with him. Pell was already looking back up at the mountain. Vessen gave Corvin a look that had a lot in it, some of which Corvin couldn't fully read. Sora looked at him with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted, as if she was adding him up, and finding the answer didn't fit the calculation she'd expected. "Go," Corvin said. They went. He walked back through town alone. The two men by the water pump were still watching him. He went back to his shop, put his apron back on, and sat down at the bench. He had balance weights to calibrate. He did not find out until the following day that one of those two men had gone directly to Warden Goss's hall to report what they'd seen, and that Goss had sat with that information for several hours, turning it over, before deciding that a mechanic who knew where the hatchlings were going was a mechanic who had become, without knowing it, a problem in a game that was much larger than him. He did not find out until 2 days after that, when 4 of Goss's men came to his door and used the word questioning in a way that was clearly meant to sound mild. He went with them. He had nothing to hide. That was, it turned out, entirely beside the point. The storage room beneath Goss's hall had been used for wine barrels at some point, and it still smelled of it, old wood, damp stone, something fermented and long gone. There was 1 lamp and 1 blanket and a bucket, and the ceiling dripped when it rained. Corvin had been in worse places. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and thought about what he knew. He had not been charged with anything. Nobody had said what the crime was. Goss's men had said questioning and then put him in here and not come back, which told him this was not about information. You don't leave a man alone for 18 hours if you actually want to ask him something. This was about keeping him out of the way. Out of the way of what was the question. He could think of a few answers, and none of them were comfortable. He did not spend much time being angry. Anger was useful in short bursts and a waste of energy otherwise. He spent the first evening going through what he'd seen on the way through town to Goss's hall, 4 of them, walking him east through the market district, past the Iron Bridge and the North Gate checkpoint where Asheville scouts had reportedly been seen. He'd been paying attention because that was what he did. He noticed where things were. The scouts had set up a line of sight position on the ridge above the bridge. You could see it if you looked at the right angle at the right time, a dull glint up in the rocks, a position that covered the road north and the road into the lower town, and if you tilted your head, a partial view of the Spire Road. That was the thing that bothered him. On the second day, the horn calls started, low and resonant from the mountain direction, not the horn sounds he knew from the town watch. Something older, he felt it more than heard it, a pressure in his chest like weather changing. That was a dragon horn. That meant the Spire had mobilized. Which meant Thon's people were already close enough to trigger a response, and the scouts on the ridge had a perfect view of anything coming down the Spire Road, and whoever was commanding the Sovereign's forces did not know the scouts were there. He looked at the storage room door. It was heavy oak, well fitted. The hinge pins on his side were old iron, and iron this old did one of 2 things. It held forever, or it had been slowly corroding for decades and felt solid right up until the moment it gave. He'd seen that 100 times with hinges. He'd fixed 100 of them. He took off his boot and used the heel to knock the lower hinge pin upward, slowly, patiently, putting pressure at the angle where old iron liked to give. After 40 minutes, it moved. After an hour and 10, both pins were out and the door swung open from the hinge side. He put his boot back on and walked out. No one stopped him in the hall. Goss's men were either gone or occupied somewhere else, and the remaining staff looked at him the way people look at something that should not be happening, but which they have no particular interest in preventing. He went out through the kitchen door and into the alley behind the hall. The town was in motion, not panicking, not yet, but accelerating. Carts were being loaded. A family with 3 young children was moving fast down the south road. The ironworks had stopped, which was the most unnerving sound of all. Nothing. He went looking for a messenger from the spire. He found one, a young dragon with dispatch markings on his collar, moving at a deliberate pace through the market district, heading for the warden's hall. Corvin stepped into his path, and to the messenger's credit, he stopped rather than simply walking through him. Corvin said, "I know where the scouts are." The messenger looked at him with the expression dragons reserved for unexpected human behavior, which was somewhere between curiosity and the calculation of whether this was a waste of time. Corvin described the ridge position above the iron bridge, the angle of visibility, the estimated number of positions based on the glints he'd seen. He told him what roads they had covered and what roads they hadn't, and which approach would come up from the scout's blind side. He told him about the partial view of the Spire Road, which was the detail that changed everything. He delivered all of it in under 2 minutes, organized, specific, the way you give information when you have thought carefully about what matters and cut out what doesn't. The messenger looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Who are you?" "Corvin Hale, I have a shop on the east side of town." He stepped out of the path. "That's all I have. I think someone should know before your people come down that road." The messenger went. Corvin walked back toward his shop. The battle started before he reached it, distant sounds from the northern ridge, fire against stone, a sound like the air tearing. He went inside, made tea, and sat at his bench. He had no weapons. He had tools. He stayed where he was and let the people who knew how to fight do what they knew how to do. The night went on for a long time. In the morning it was quiet. Veldmore was still standing. The warehouse on the east block was not, but the bridge was intact, and the north road was open, and there were Spire soldiers in the market district, which was unsettling in its way, but also, he had to admit, a relief. He opened the shop. He had a window shutter he'd never gotten back to. He might as well start there. A sound like a millstone being dragged across flagstone came from the direction of the Spire Road, and the wall of Corvin's shop vibrated once and settled. He was holding a shutter hinge against the window frame, trying to get the angle right, and he nearly dropped it. He set it down on the bench instead and looked at the back door, which was still open from when Vesson had come in through the window 20 minutes ago and somehow ended up leaving through the back by accident. The sound came again, slow, regular, getting closer. He looked at the 3 hatchlings. They were arranged around his shop in their usual positions, Pell on the bench with the bird, Vesson looking at things on the shelf, Sora in the doorway. None of them had told him they were coming. They had simply appeared, the way they always did, and he had not asked where they'd been during the battle, because it was not his business and they were visibly unharmed. Sora's jaw had tightened. She said very quietly, "He came himself." Corvin looked at her. "Who?" She looked at the front door. The knock that came was not a knock. It was a single contact of something enormous against the frame of the door, careful, controlled, the way you touch something when you know you could break it without effort. The whole frame shook. Dust fell from the ceiling beam. Corvin crossed the shop and opened the door. He had to tilt his head back significantly. Sovereign Draveth was copper black, the color of old bronze that had gone very dark in places that mattered, and he was folded into the smallest version of himself that something that size could achieve, and it was still substantially too large for the street. His eyes were amber, several shades deeper than Pell's, and they moved over Corvin with an attention that was not hostile, but was not warm either. It was the attention of something very old deciding what a new thing was. Corvin said, "I'll put more water on." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Corvin turned and walked to the small stove at the back of the shop, because the water was not going to put itself on, and he had said he would do it, and he was not the kind of man who said things he did not mean. He heard rather than saw Draveth fold himself through the doorway. The roof groaned. Something creaked near the east wall and held. Pell had slid off the bench and moved to stand near the door, which was probably smart, and Vessin had pressed himself against the shelving unit, which was less smart because the shelving unit was now bearing significant additional weight in the form of a leaning sovereign's tail. Sora stepped forward and said, very formally, "Father." Draveth made a sound that was not exactly a word and not exactly a breath, the sound of a great deal of effort being contained in a very small direction. Then he looked at Corvin's back and waited. Corvin set the water to heat. He turned around. "Sit down," he said, "if you can manage it." He had not rehearsed that. It came out the same way all his sentences came out, in the same plain tone he used for everything, and he would have given a great deal to know what it sounded like to someone for whom no one had used that tone in, probably, 40 years. Draveth sat. The floor did something complicated but did not give. The roof groaned again and stopped. "I want to understand," Draveth said. His voice was low and made the lamp flicker. "My hatchlings have been coming here for weeks." He looked at each of them in turn, Sora, Vessin, Pell, and then back to Corvin. "Why did you fix their things?" Corvin thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about any question worth answering. The first one came in with something broken that mattered to him. "I fix things. It wasn't complicated." "You asked for nothing." They didn't have anything to pay. It would have been strange to make them feel the weight of needing something. Draveth was still, not the stillness of calm, Corvin thought, but the stillness of something very large trying to be careful about how it moved in a very small room. He looked at his hatchlings again. Pell had the bird in both hands, pressed against his chest, the way he always held it. Vessin had stopped leaning on the shelving unit and was watching his father with an expression that was trying very hard to look neutral and wasn't managing it. Sora's arms were at her sides, not crossed, which was unusual. "You walked them through the town," Draveth said, "in view of everyone. Someone needed to make sure they got to the road. That was not your responsibility." "No," Corvin agreed, "but they were children and the town was afraid, and afraid towns make bad decisions about who they blame, so I walked with them." He paused. "I didn't have anything better to do that hour." The water began to heat. Pell made a small sound and then pressed his thumb lever on the bird's back, and the bird sang 4 notes, looping, bright, filling the cramped and suddenly very quiet shop. Draveth looked at the bird. He looked at it for a long time. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice, something so small that Corvin nearly missed it, but it was there. "He has not made that sing in 8 months, the sovereign said." Coven said nothing. He poured the tea. He poured it into a cup meant for a human hand, which was the only kind of cup he had, and set it on the bench between them, which was all he could do, and Draveth looked at the cup for a moment with an expression Coven couldn't read, and then he asked a question that surprised him. "What did you lose?" Coven was quiet, then he said, "My wife 4 years ago." Draveth looked at him. The amber eyes were very level. "And you still fix things." "Someone has to." He sat down across from the largest living creature in the known world and picked up his own cup. "Stopping doesn't bring anyone back. It just means more things stay broken." The bird looped back to the first note and started again. Outside, Voldemar was beginning to find its feet after a long night, and neither of them said anything for a while. 3 weeks after the battle, Pale stone began arriving in Voldemar on flatbed carts pulled by draft animals that were struggling with the weight. The stone was a culk that no local quarry produced, a clean grey-white with a faint luminescence that showed in the right light, and it was cut very precisely. The foreman of the crew that arrived with it told the town council it was for the East Market Wall, the one destroyed in the fighting, and that the stone came from the spire. The council sat with that information for a long moment. No one spoke. Then the eldest member said they should probably get out of the way and let the crew work, and everyone agreed. Coven watched the foundation being laid from his shop doorway one morning with a cup of tea in his hand. The stone went in fast, the crew knew what they were doing, and the culk of it against the old soot-blackened brick of the surrounding buildings was striking in a way that Coven thought was probably intentional. It would be visible from a long way off. Everyone would know where it came from. He went back inside. He had a grandfather clock that had been dropped in someone's move and was now running 8 minutes slow per day, which was fucksubbed but tedious, and he had been putting it off. The letter came 4 days later. It was delivered by a formal messenger in Spire livery, and it had more seals on it than Coven thought any document needed, and it was written in a style so elaborately formal that he read the first paragraph 3 times before finding the plain meaning inside it. Someone had tried to rein it in. There was a note in the margin of the second page in different ink that read, simply, shorter, but it was still 2 pages. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept important papers, next to the deed to the shop and his wife's handwriting on a grocery list he had never thrown away. The letter did 2 things. The first was to name him formally as someone who had treated the royal heirs with dignity without cause or benefit, which in the formal language meant, without knowing who they were, without standing to gain anything, and without being asked. In Dragon Court tradition, this was a record. It would be kept. His name would be in their archive. The second was to remove the warden's authority over the Spire Road and the compact between Voldemar and the mountain. Going forward, there would be a council compact, direct, between the town and the Spire, no intermediary. Gus had been removed from office. The note about Gus was the shortest sentence in the entire 2-page letter. Coven thought the author had probably enjoyed writing that part. Sora came back on a morning in late autumn, alone, when the sky was the culk of slate and the ironworks were quiet for the weekly rest. She did not knock. She came around the back and sat on the crate, and Coven moved the clock parts to make room and kept working. She watched him for a while. She did that, sat, and watched with her arms on her knees and her head slightly forward, the way someone watches something they are trying to understand past the surface of it. After some time she said, "My father asked me why we didn't tell him about you." Coven set down the regulator. "Wait, what did you say?" "I said I didn't know." She was quiet, "but I've been thinking about it since." He waited. "I think," she said slowly, "we didn't want anyone to ruin it." She looked at her hands, not at him. "You treated us like we were just children with broken things, not like something powerful and dangerous that needed managing or something strange that needed explaining. Just children." She paused. "I don't think that's happened to us before, not from outside the Spire." Coven was quiet for a moment. "You were children with broken things, that's what you were." She looked at him then. He looked back. The clock ticked between them, running slightly wrong but closer now to right than it had been an hour ago. "He doesn't trust humans," she said. "My father, he decided a long time ago that humans were too small to matter, too temporary." A pause. "He hasn't said that to me since the battle. He hasn't said anything about humans at all, actually, but I think something changed." "Maybe," Coven said, "things do." She stood up. She was taller when she stood than he remembered, and then he thought she was probably still growing, and she would keep growing for a very long time, and the 3 children who used to come in through his back door would become something immense and ancient, and maybe, somewhere in that long future, they would remember a dusty shop and a man who asked no questions and fixed what was brought to him. That seemed like enough. She was already at the door when she stopped and said, still not looking back, "He's written your name into the Spire's permanent record. That means anyone of our line, for as long as the line holds, will know who you were." A beat. "He doesn't do that." She left. Coven picked up the regulator. "Wait." The clock needed another quarter turn. Outside, the pale stone wall of the East Market was nearly finished, and the children of Voldemar had decided it was an excellent surface to bounce a ball against, and no one was chasing them away. The mechanical bird sat on the shelf where Pell had left it, between a weather vane and an old barometer, where the morning light came through and caught the rubies in its eyes. Pell had come back twice since the day Druvath sat in this shop and made the roof groan, not for the bird, just to sit. Coven supposed that was its own kind of repair, something broken finding the place where it had been made whole again and coming back to remember what that felt like. He finished the clock by noon. He set it running. It ticked through the afternoon, clean and even, keeping time the way his wife had taught him to keep it, not by watching it, but by trusting that the small, careful work you did today would hold.